The morning they told Willa Crane to get out, the sky was the color of a tin plate left in the snow. She stood in the doorway of the house where she had lived for 11 years, where she had scrubbed the floors and mended the curtains and pressed her husband's shirts until her hands went raw, and listened to her brother-in-law tell her that the property had been surveyed, the deed reviewed, and that her name appeared on nothing. His wife stood slightly behind him, not looking at Willa directly. Neither of them offered her a chair. It was November. The first real cold had come down from the mountains 3 days earlier, settling into the valley like something that intended to stay. "You'll want to take your personal things," her brother-in-law, Douglas Crane, said. He was a careful man. He said it the way a man says something he has already rehearsed. Willa looked past him into the kitchen. The iron stove she had hauled from the wagon with her own 2 hands, the year she and Martin arrived. The window she had replaced the glass in twice. The dried herbs hanging above the sideboard that she had grown herself in the small plot behind the house. "The herbs," she said. Douglas blinked. "Pardon? The herbs above the sideboard. I planted them." He glanced back at his wife. His wife said nothing. "Take what you need," he said finally. "We'll need the house settled before the week is out." She took the herbs. She took her mother's quilt, a spare dress, her winter coat, and a small tin box that held the only money she had left after Martin's burial, $41 and some coins. She took the hatchet from the woodpile because it had been a wedding gift from her own family, not his. She left the stove. She left the curtains she had sewn. She left 11 years of work, folded into the walls of a house that no longer had her name on anything. She did not cry until she was past the tree line and certain no one could see her. Martin Crane had died in August, 3 months before. A horse kick to the chest, one of those senseless accidents that happen in broad daylight on an ordinary afternoon. He was 40 years old. They had no children. They had the house and the land, and the cattle that Douglas had been managing alongside them for the past 2 years. And now Douglas had the papers to prove the land was held in the family name, which was his name, not hers. Willa had married into it. That was the difference. She had known it was coming. She had told herself she was prepared. But knowing a thing and standing in the November cold with a quilt under your arm and nowhere to go are 2 entirely different conditions. She walked north because the town of Harlow was south, and she did not want to walk into Harlow, not yet. She did not want the looks. The careful pity of women who still had their husbands, the well-meaning questions about what she planned to do. She needed to think before she could answer questions like that, and she could not think while someone was watching her face. There was an old trapper's cabin 2 miles up the ridge. She knew it because Martin had used it once during a hunting season and described it to her in his careful, factual way. A single room, a stone chimney, a door that stuck when it rained. She did not know if it still stood. She went anyway. It stood. The door stuck, but not from rain, from disuse. She put her shoulder into it, and it gave, swinging inward and letting out a smell of cold ash and animal and something green, which surprised her. A patch of moss had grown across one corner of the floor where the roof had leaked and then sealed itself. The stone chimney was intact. Someone at some point had left a cord of wood stacked against the far wall, dry enough by the look of it to catch. Willa set down her things. She examined the roof for gaps, found 2, and noted them. She checked the door's hang and confirmed the hinge was sound. She looked at the cord of wood and calculated how long it would last if she kept the fire low and banked it well at night. Then she sat down on the floor. There was no furniture, and let herself think. She was 31 years old. She had $41. She had a quilt, a coat, a hatchet, and enough herb bundles to last the winter if she was careful with them. She had 2 hands that knew how to work. She had a roof. She had been left with less than this before, when she was 17 and her father's farm went under and her mother took sick in the same season. She had managed then. She would manage now. But first she needed to understand what she had beyond the cabin. She needed to know the land. The ridge ran about 4 miles northeast before it broke into open meadow. Willa spent the first week mapping it the way her father had taught her, on foot early, before the light went flat. She found a creek that ran year-round, fed by a spring higher up the slope. She found a south-facing clearing, where the snow thinned early, and the soil looked like it might be worth something come spring. She found, on the 3rd day, a cave. It was not a dramatic thing, a split in the rock face, barely shoulder width, that opened into a chamber roughly the size of a small barn. The temperature inside was a constant that she recognized immediately, the same temperature her mother's root cellar had held in February, cold enough to preserve, warm enough that nothing froze solid. She stood in the entrance for a long time with her lamp raised, looking at the walls. The floor was dry. The stone overhead was solid. A narrow fissure in the ceiling let in a thin column of outside air. Not light, just air, which meant the space would breathe without flooding. It was, she thought, the best natural cellar she had ever seen. She started carrying things, not much at first. The herbs, resorted and tied properly. A cloth bag of dried beans she had carried out of the house and nearly left behind. But she began to see the space differently as the days passed. Not just as storage, but as something she could use. She had grown mushrooms before. In her mother's cellar years ago, when a wet summer had made them plentiful, and her mother had the idea of cultivating the spawn on wood scraps. Willa had watched and helped and eventually managed the whole operation herself for 2 seasons. It was not difficult once you understood that mushrooms did not want light. They wanted moisture and consistency and a substrate they could root into. The cave had all of that. She went to work. By December, the snow came in earnest. The valley below the ridge got 2 feet in a single week, and the road into Harlow became impassable for anything without snowshoes. Willa had snowshoes. Martin's old pair, found hanging on a peg inside the cabin that she had missed on her first examination. She wore them every other day, moving between the cabin and the cave, checking her growing frames. She had built the frames from scrap wood she salvaged, from a collapsed lean she found on the eastern face of the ridge. Rough work, nothing squared, but functional. She had packed them with a mix of dead wood, leaf matter, and soil from the creek bank, and seeded them with spawn she had collected from 3 different species of edible mushrooms she found growing on a rotting log nearby. She kept meticulous count of everything, the way her mother had kept count of canning jars, by number, by date, by location on the shelf. She did not eat well in December, but she ate. There were mushrooms, dried beans cooked slowly in a pot with creek water, and the occasional rabbit she caught in the snares she had set along the lower trails. She lost weight. Her hands got rough in a way they hadn't been since she was a girl. She slept early and hard and woke before light. She did not think often about Douglas Crane or the house. There was not much room for it in a day structured around survival. When the thought came, usually in the hour before sleep, when her body was tired but her mind had not yet let go, she allowed it to pass through without catching on anything. It was like watching a cold front move across the sky. You could not stop it, you noted it and kept moving. What she thought about instead was the spring. She had found, in Martin's old hunting bag, left hanging beside the snowshoes, a paper packet of seeds. He had written on the outside in his careful block letters, "For W," that was all. He had bought them sometime before he died, she guessed, intending to give them to her for the kitchen garden she had been planning. Turnips, parsnips, a small amount of rye. She held the packet for a long time the evening she found it. She set it on the shelf above the firebox where it would stay dry and not freeze. She looked at it every morning. The blizzard came in January, not the ordinary kind, the kind that comes in sideways and does not stop for 3 days and leaves the world remade when it finally lifts. Willa stayed in the cabin for the duration, burning the wood low, keeping the drafts sealed with strips of cloth she cut from a spare shirt. She ate mushrooms and broth and counted her supplies and did not panic, which took more effort than it sounds. On the 4th day, when the wind had dropped to something manageable, she strapped on the snowshoes and went to check the cave. The entrance was drifted half shut. She dug it out with her hands and the hatchet, and spent 20 minutes that felt much longer working the opening clear. Inside, the temperature had not changed by more than a degree. The frames were intact. The mushrooms had not been touched by the cold. She sat down in the entrance of the cave with her back against the stone and let out a long, slow breath. Then she heard the bells. It was a faint sound, coming from the direction of the valley. She climbed to the top of the ridge and looked down. Below, barely visible through the snow haze, a string of horses and a wagon were moving toward Harlow at a pace that told her something was wrong. Nobody moved that slowly without reason. She watched for a while. Then she went back to her work. She learned what had happened 4 days later, when a man came up the ridge on horseback. A young man she did not know, riding carefully through snow that was still knee-deep on his horse. He called out before he came near the cabin, which she appreciated. His name was Elias Pryor. He was 23, and worked as a hand on a farm on the south edge of town. He had been sent by his employer to ask if there was anyone on the ridge who might have stores to trade, because Harlow was running short. The blizzard, he explained, had come after an already bad autumn. The grain merchant's supply wagon had not arrived before the passes closed. 2 families had burned through their winter wood in the first 3 weeks of cold, and now sat in houses that were not far above freezing. The town's communal flour supply was down to less than half of what it should have been for January. Willa listened to all of this without interrupting. When he was done, she asked him 2 questions. How many people in Harlow? And what were they willing to offer in trade? He told her, about 80 souls. And as for trade, he said his employer was prepared to offer lumber, labor, or cash, depending on what was needed. She thought for a moment. Then she told him to come back in 2 days. She spent those 2 days in the cave, taking a thorough inventory of what she had. The mushrooms were productive beyond what she had originally planned for. She had been conservative in her estimates, and the cave conditions had proved better than expected. She had enough dried mushrooms to fill 3 large sacks. She had dried beans. She had, with some careful adjustment, a surplus, but she had also been thinking about the seeds, and about the spring, and about what a person could do if they had a good cellar and a south-facing slope and were willing to work a second season on the ridge. When Elias came back, she had a list ready. She would provide what she could spare: mushrooms, dried beans, some herb bundles for flavoring and for medicine, since she knew a few preparations well enough to make them useful. In exchange, she did not want cash. She wanted materials: 2 bolts of oilcloth, a barrel of cornmeal, 6 fence posts, and a half-dozen glass canning jars if any could be found. Elias looked at the list. He looked at her. "You've been living up here alone since November," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have," she said. He looked at the cave entrance, visible from where they stood. "How? The same way anyone does," she said. "One day at a time." He took the list back to town. He came back 3 days later with a wagon and 2 other men. They carried everything she had asked for, plus a small sack of cornmeal beyond the agreed amount. His employer's addition, he said, by way of goodwill. They loaded her surplus carefully, and she showed them, briefly, how the cave held its temperature and why that mattered for storage. The 2 men who had come with Elias were quiet during this explanation. She could tell they were paying attention. Before he left, Elias stopped at the cave entrance and looked back at her. "People in town are going to ask where this came from," he said. "Tell them," she said. "It's not a secret. February was harder than January in the way that late winter is always harder, not because the weather is worse, necessarily, but because the cold has been going on long enough that it stops feeling temporary." Willa kept to her routine. She checked the cave every day. She maintained the fire. She worked on the south-facing clearing when the weather permitted, turning the soil with a stick, and then with a length of iron, she found, buried in the snow near the collapsed lean-to, an old cultivating tool, rusted but usable. She thought about the seeds. Rye, she knew, was not a forgiving crop in ordinary circumstances. But it was a forgiving crop in bad circumstances. That was the difference that mattered. It could go into ground that would ruin most other grains. It could take cold that would kill wheat. Her mother had grown it in a patch behind the house in a year when everything else failed, and she had made bread from it that tasted like iron and earth and was the best thing Willa had ever eaten because it was what kept them fed that winter. She had never grown it herself. She had watched. She had helped. That would have to be enough. She started the seedlings inside the cabin in late February, in shallow trays she made from boards salvaged from the same lean-to. She kept them near the firebox and checked them twice a day. The germination rate was not perfect, but it was not nothing. Elias came back in March. He came alone this time, and he came on foot, which told her the roads were still bad. He brought a letter from a woman in town, a Mrs. Addie Trowbridge, who signed herself as the chair of the Harlow Ladies' Auxiliary. The letter thanked Willa for the mushrooms and the herbs, which had apparently been welcomed more than she had expected. One of the herbs she had sent, a bundle of dried elderberry, had been used by the town's doctor in treating a child who had developed a cough over the winter. The child had recovered. Mrs. Trowbridge wrote this in her letter as though it were a matter of public record. The letter also asked, in careful language, whether Willa might be willing to come to town when the roads cleared. There were people, Mrs. Trowbridge wrote, who would like to ask her some questions about what she was doing on the ridge. Willa read the letter twice. Then she folded it and set it on the shelf next to Martin's seed packet. She told Elias to tell Mrs. Trowbridge yes. The roads cleared in April. Willa came down from the ridge on a morning that smelled like mud and snowmelt and the particular freshness of air after a long winter. She had been on the ridge for 5 months. She had $41 still in her tin box. She had spent none of it. She was thinner than she had been in November, and her coat had a patch on one elbow she had sewn herself. But her boots were sound, and she walked straight. Harlow was a town of roughly one main street, a church, a mill, and several dozen houses arranged without particular order on the flat land where 2 creeks converged. She had lived close to it for 11 years, and known it without really knowing it. The way you know a place, when your life is busy, and your reasons to go to town are mostly practical. She walked into the general store, which was also where the post was kept, and the woman behind the counter, a tall, gray-haired person she knew by sight but not by name, stopped what she was doing and looked at her. "You're the woman from the ridge," the woman said. "Willa Crane," Willa said. "I know who you are." The woman put her hands on the counter. "You're the one who sent the mushrooms." "I am." The woman studied her for a moment. Then she said, "You want some coffee. It's not good coffee, but it's hot." Willa said yes. The meeting with Mrs. Trowbridge took place that afternoon in the back room of the church, which was the largest indoor space in town that wasn't a barn. There were about 15 people there when Willa arrived, mostly women. A few men she recognized as farm owners from the area. Douglas Crane was not among them, which she noted. She did not know whether to be relieved or not. Mrs. Addie Trowbridge was a small woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes, and the manner of someone who had been running things for a long time without receiving credit for it. She shook Willa's hand and indicated a chair and did not waste time getting to the point. "We want to know what you were doing up there," she said, "in practical terms. Not the hardship part. I think we can imagine the hardship part. The part where you kept 80 people from running out of food in February." Willa considered how to answer this. "I had a cave," she said. "The temperature in it is consistent. You can grow certain things in that kind of environment without light. Mushrooms, in particular, but also sprouts, and possibly a few other things I haven't tried yet. I also dried what I foraged and preserved it as carefully as I could." "And the herbs," said one of the men. "I brought those from she paused briefly. "From the house I left in November. I grow them and dry them. Some of them are useful medicinally, and I can tell you which ones and how." There was a short silence. "You lived up there from November to now," Mrs. Trowbridge said. "Alone, yes. Why didn't you come to town?" Willa looked at the table. She considered several answers. She chose the one that was true without being the whole truth. "I needed to see if I could manage first," she said. "I didn't want to come into town as a problem to be solved." She heard someone shift in their chair. She did not look up to see who. "That was foolish," Mrs. Trowbridge said, not unkindly. "We would have helped." "I know," Willa said. "I know that now." She told them everything. How she had found the cave and recognized its potential. How she had cultivated the mushroom frames. How she had mapped the ridge for water sources and tested the soil in the clearing. How she had rationed through the blizzard and managed the fire and kept the snowshoes in good condition so she could move when moving was necessary. She told them about the rye seedlings, which were still in their trays in the cabin. She told them about the south-facing clearing and what she believed it could yield. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. "Can you teach this?" one of the men said. He was a farmer named Gideon Wells, someone who had been here longer than most. He asked it simply, without inflection, as though it were a practical question, which it was. "I can teach what I know," Willa said, "which isn't everything. But it's a start. The cave," he said. "Is there only the one?" "On that ridge, yes. But this whole valley is sitting on limestone. There are likely others. You'd have to look." Gideon Wells nodded slowly. He looked at Mrs. Trowbridge. Mrs. Trowbridge looked at Willa. "We have a problem," Mrs. Trowbridge said. "We have a schoolhouse that isn't being fully used. We have a town that just went through a bad winter and knows it could go through another one. And we have you." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you need?" Willa did not answer right away. She had been thinking about this question, in one form or another, since January, since the blizzard. Since the morning she stood in a doorway and listened to Douglas Crane tell her that her name was on nothing. She had turned it over in her mind during the long evenings in the cabin, the same way she turned problems with the mushroom frames, approaching from different angles, looking for where the weakness was, finding the point where something could actually hold. She did not want Charity. She had known that much since November. She did not want to walk back into someone else's structure and occupy a corner of it and be grateful for the corner. What she wanted was harder to name. Something she had been building, she realized, without knowing the name of it, since the day she walked up that ridge with a quilt and a hatchet and nowhere in particular to go. A place to work, she said finally. Not borrowed, not temporary, my own. Mrs. Trowbridge looked at her steadily. We have a parcel, she said, on the east side of town. No house on it yet. It was set aside for a school garden that never got planted. She paused. It has a good southern exposure. Then that's where I'd start, Willa said. She moved off the ridge in May, not all at once. She went back twice to collect what she had left there, including the mushroom frames, which she dismantled carefully and carried down in sections. The cave she left as she had found it, more or less, except for the wooden shelf she had built along the north wall. She left the shelf, she thought. If someone else found it someday, it might be useful to them. The parcel on the east side of town was 50 feet by 120, with the south end opening to good light, and the soil running dark and loose once you got past the first few inches of packed surface. She broke the surface with the same iron tool she had carried down from the ridge. Gideon Wells sent 2 of his hands over for an afternoon to help turn the ground properly. Mrs. Trowbridge arrived one morning with 3 women from the auxiliary who brought seedlings, tomatoes, pumpkins, a variety of beans she hadn't grown before. You don't have to take them, Mrs. Trowbridge said, but they'll go to waste otherwise. Willa took them. She planted the rye in the cleared section at the back. It came up in 10 days, not uniformly, not perfectly, but enough. She staked the rows and kept the birds off with netting salvaged from an old fishing trap she found in the town's storage shed. She watered carefully and checked the soil every morning, the way her mother had taught her to check soil, by feel first, by color second. In June, she found a carpenter named Thaddeus Owens, who was willing to build a small structure on the parcel in exchange for half a season's worth of dried herbs and the promise of mushroom frames of his own the following year. The structure was simple: a room and a half, a solid stove, a door that hung straight. She moved in on a Tuesday and did not make anything of it. On the first evening, she sat on the step and looked at the garden. The rye was past her knee. The mushroom frames she had rebuilt in a shaded corner of the lot were producing steadily. The beans were climbing their stakes. Somewhere in the back of the lot, something she could not yet identify was coming up between the turnip rows. She suspected one of the auxiliary women had tucked in a few extra seeds without mentioning it. She had $41 still in her tin box. She had not spent them. She was not sure what she was saving them for, exactly, or whether she was saving them at all, or whether they had simply become the things she kept to remind herself of where she had started. She taught the first class in September, in the unused room of the schoolhouse. 14 people came, mostly women, 2 men, 1 boy of about 12, who sat in the back with his arms crossed, and then moved closer when she started talking about soil temperature. She taught what she knew. She taught it simply, the way her mother had taught her. Here is the fact. Here is the reason for the fact. Here is what happens if you ignore it. She did not make it more than it was. She did not make it less. Gideon Wells came on the second day and sat in the back. He did not say much during the session, but when it was done, he came up and told her that the thing about consistent underground temperature was something he had wondered about for years and never had explained to him properly. It's not complicated, Willa said. Most true things aren't, he said. Doesn't mean they're easy to see. Douglas Crane came to town in October. She did not seek him out, and he did not seek her. She saw him from across the main street on a Thursday morning, loading something into a wagon. He looked over and saw her. He held her gaze for a moment. She looked back at him steadily. Then she looked away and continued walking. She was carrying a bag of cornmeal she had just traded for at the general store, and her hands were full, and she had 3 things to do before noon. She did not have time to stand in the street thinking about Douglas Crane. That evening, she sat on her step and thought about him a little, because there was time for it then. She thought about the house, about the stove she had left behind, about the morning in November when she stood in the doorway with a quilt under her arm. She could not say she forgave him. She wasn't certain that was the right word, or that it was required of her. What she could say was that she had taken the thing he had done, the loss of it, the unfairness of it, the cold November morning of it, and she had carried it up a ridge and used it. She had built something out of the worst season of her life, and what she had built was still standing. That was not nothing. She had a house. She had a garden and a structure that could teach what she knew. She had a town that knew her name and was better prepared for winter than it had been the year before. She had, somewhere on the east side of town, a rye crop that was going to give her enough for seed and enough for flour, and probably a small surplus besides. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She opened the tin box and took out the seed packet. She had moved it here when she moved off the ridge, still folded in its paper the way Martin had left it. She set it on the shelf above the stove, which was her stove now, where it had been before. She thought that next spring she would plant more. She thought she would ask the boy who sat in the back of the class, the 12-year-old with his arms crossed, if he wanted to learn to do it himself. She turned down the lamp and went to sleep.